Welcome back. I'm Richard D. Wolff. Tonight we follow the money to a dinner table you were not invited to. Cameras roll, crystal clinks. They call it the steak summit. Thick cuts, thicker power. While millions cut meat out of their carts to cover rent, the president knives into a porterhouse the size of a ledger and tells the country the meat industry has never been stronger. Strong for whom? Let's get blunt. Grocery prices stabilized, they say. Stabilized at a new, painful normal. A family of four is paying an extra $1,480 a year for the same cart eggs whipsawed by disease, coffee by climate, and everything else by a tariff roulette launched from Washington. The tariff show isn't policy, it's a billboard, and the billboards don't pay. You do. A 10% levy here, 25% there, and by the time the cargo passes 3 ports and 4 distributors, you're looking at a stealth food tax stacked inside every barcode. That's not economics. That's extraction. Inside the banquet hall, donors trade toasts like futures contracts. Beef executives tout resilience. A senator praises America First protein. The cameras linger on the marbling. They never pan to the checkout line where a single mom in Dayton runs the math. Protein per dollar. She switches from steak to canned beans and tells her kid it's Taco Tuesday again because stories taste better than scarcity. That is what political theater costs quiet, private sacrifices off camera. We are told tariffs protect workers. Which workers? The line cook at a Nebraska plant earning $17.25 an hour, while shareholder buybacks top $6.2 billion across the sector. The rancher in Montana squeezed by feed, fuel, and financing while packers post record margins. Protection for producers should mean bargaining power, price floors, and antitrust teeth. What we got is a toll booth economy, global chaos at the border, domestic consolidation at the plant, and a White House that calls it victory when the stock pops for 6 hours after dessert. At the summit, a slide deck flashes. Stronger America. Off screen, a USDA chart shows meat at home prices up 18% from the pre pandemic baseline, down only when compared to last year's peak. That's like throwing someone into a deep pool, hauling them up 1 foot, and declaring them saved. The chef plates a ribeye. The country gets a press release. The president laughs with men who never check unit prices, men for whom inflation is a headline, not a habit. Let me spell out the contradictions. If tariffs were a winning long game, we would see secure supply, falling consumer prices, rising real wages, diversified packing capacity, and labor standards with teeth. Instead, we see volatility passed to households, windfall rents to middlemen, and a camera ready banquet that markets strength while hiding scarcity. The cruelty is casual. The arrogance is choreographed. He eats the symbol of American power while others count pennies for protein. This isn't a culture war, it's a class receipt. And I'm going to show you line by line what's on it. The donor menu, the subsidy maze, the tariff transfer, the labor squeeze, and the media framing that sells you hunger as patriotism. Keep your eyes on the marbling. The story isn't in the steak, it's in the margins and who gets to eat them next. The footage cuts from the banquet hall to a factory floor in Kansas. Fluorescent lights, empty lockers. A supervisor tells local news that shipments are delayed due to new export duties. Translation, tariffs struck again. The plant slows, hours get cut, and families go from 40 hours to 28. That's not job protection, that's wage evaporation disguised as economic defense. Meanwhile, the White House podium repeats the same slogan: we're winning the trade war. But ask any worker whose grocery bill jumped 22% since 2020 who's really winning. A loaf of bread costs $3.49, up from $1.99 before Trump's great American tariff push. A gallon of milk, $5.12. Coffee, luxury. Beef, for millions, extinct. Yet on TV, the president smiles, fork in hand, flanked by executives whose bonuses rival entire small town budgets. The optics scream prosperity. The reality bleeds austerity. The contradiction is surgical propaganda served medium rare. Trump called the steak summit a celebration of American strength. But whose strength? The top 1% of agribusiness giants, Tyson, Cargill, JBS, saw profits rise 34% under the tariff chaos, while ranchers' margins collapsed. Farmers went bankrupt, then got bailout checks funded by the same taxpayers paying higher grocery bills. That's not protectionism, that's circular exploitation. And yet, in the spin room, they framed it as heroism, a bold stand against global manipulation. But here's the truth. Tariffs didn't punish China. They punished Chicago. They didn't stop Brazil's beef exports. They priced out America's middle class. What Trump built wasn't a wall around the U.S. economy. It was a toll gate, and every family in line pays. Richard Wolff would tell you, this isn't capitalism out of control. This is capitalism perfectly in control of you. While the cameras chase headlines about resilience, the underlying math doesn't lie. The average American household now spends 13.6% of income on food, the highest since 1981. That's 4 decades of policy undone in 4 years of performative trade war. And still the illusion continues, steak for the few, sacrifice for the many. The optics are cinematic. Trump slicing into his prime rib, flashes popping, sound bites looping, while the price ticker in your supermarket aisle ticks upward like a silent alarm. He promises America first, but in reality, it's you last, because the power he serves isn't American, it's corporate. The table he sits at isn't for workers, it's for shareholders. And the banquet isn't about feeding the nation, it's about feeding a narrative. This is how economic theater works. Frame hardship as pride, frame scarcity as sacrifice, frame hunger as heroism. Wrap it all in a flag, and no one dares call it exploitation. But every empire has a meal like this one final feast before the crash. The guests toast greatness. The staff goes unpaid. And outside, the streets get quieter, except for one rising sound, the rumble of the people who finally realize they're not invited. By morning, the Steak Summit headlines dominate cable news. A triumph for American agriculture, one network cheers. Trump feeds the economy, another quips. None mention that USDA data released the same day shows meat consumption among working families dropped 17% over the past 2 years. That's not prosperity, that's rationing disguised as recovery. The irony writes itself. The president celebrates abundance while the public adjusts to austerity. He talks of feeding the world, but can't explain why millions of Americans are now substituting beef with protein powder and lentils. It's not a dietary choice, it's economic triage. Let's be clear, this isn't about steak, it's about symbolism. For generations, the American dinner table stood for stability, a place where hard work meant a full plate. Trump turned that plate into a political prop. He sold the illusion that tariffs build strength, when in truth they build scarcity. He told the working class they were winning again, while quietly taxing their groceries through trade retaliation that never landed on the wealthy. Every 25% import duty on beef feed raised production costs. Every retaliatory tariff from allies squeezed exports. It's a feedback loop of incompetence, chaos at customs, uncertainty in contracts, and panic in pricing. The same week, Trump toasted with ranch magnates. Over 180 small farms in the Midwest filed for liquidation. Yet the cameras stayed fixed on his smile, not the wreckage. In economic terms, it's called distributional distortion. Wealth flows upward, risk flows downward. In moral terms, it's called theft. And in political terms, it's genius because the victims keep applauding. A man in Wisconsin tells a reporter, I voted for him because he said he'd protect farmers. Now I'm selling my cattle to pay taxes on feed. The contradiction doesn't break loyalty, it deepens it. That's the real achievement, transforming suffering into allegiance. Trump's base doesn't see the banquet as mockery, they see it as aspiration. The steak is proof that someone like them made it to the top. They don't realize the system was never designed for them to join the meal. They're the collateral, not the guests. Meanwhile, Trump's advisors spin the chaos as a necessary reset. They claim short-term pain will lead to long-term sovereignty. But sovereignty for who? Food monopolies, corporate exporters, and a political elite that weaponizes patriotism to mask hunger. It's economic nationalism rebranded as populism, a red, white, and blue sugarcoat on a rotting supply chain. And yet, in the chaos, there's a quiet rebellion forming not in protests or marches, but in kitchen tables. People talk, compare bills, connect dots. They're realizing the pattern. When Trump wins a war, Americans lose a meal. That realization, slow, quiet, contagious, is how revolutions start in a supermarket aisle. The White House doubles down. A new statement calls rising grocery prices evidence of a strong domestic market. Translation, if you're broke, it means America's winning. That's how Trump economics works. Pain is proof of progress. At the next press briefing, a reporter asks, Mr. President, what do you say to Americans who can no longer afford beef? He smirks, they'll eat chicken. It's called adaptation. That quote alone should be engraved on the gravestone of America's working class because behind that grin is a philosophy that ordinary people exist to absorb policy failure, that their diet, their debt, their daily grind are expendable tools in a photo op war against invisible enemies. The tariffs he brags about, they've added $128 billion in cumulative costs to US consumers and small businesses. That's an invisible tax larger than any congressional budget he ever signed. But unlike regular taxes, this one doesn't build roads or schools. It builds applause. At the Steak Summit's after party, lobbyists celebrate the record quarter of America's largest meat exporters. Tyson stock up 11%. Cargill's profit margins double. JBS announces a new buyback program. The same week, grocery workers in Detroit strike over frozen wages and health cuts. Two economies, one country, one feasting, one fasting. The irony, the president's own Buy American campaign quietly increased beef imports from Australia by 24%, rebranded and sold as U.S. premium cuts. That's not policy, that's laundering nationalism for profit. And still the crowd chants, USA, USA. Wolff would call this what it is, an empire eating itself not out of hunger, but habit. Because once the spectacle becomes the system, truth becomes irrelevant. The steak doesn't have to be real. It only has to look juicy on camera. Watch the footage again. The lighting, the laughter, the red tie glinting in the chandelier glow. It's not dinner, it's propaganda served on porcelain. The audience isn't the guests, it's you. And every bite he takes is an instruction. Obey, consume, forget. This is what late stage capitalism looks like, power turning indulgence into ideology. They starve you with inflation, then sell you the image of fullness. They crush your wages, then thank you for your sacrifice. They create the crisis, then profit from the cure, and yet there's one thing they still can't control: perception. Because the illusion cracks. The moment you see the absurdity, that patriotism now tastes like cafeteria chicken, and the dream they sold you is being chewed, swallowed, and televised by the very man who told you he'd save it. The banquet ends, the plates clear, but the cameras stay. The steak is gone, the story isn't. By the next week, the steak summit becomes a meme. Clips of Trump cutting into his steak flood TikTok, spliced next to footage of empty meat aisles and grocery receipts that look like mortgage bills. The internet calls it filet MAGA, a luxury cut seasoned with hypocrisy. But beneath the satire, a darker truth simmers. This wasn't a gaffe. It was a glimpse of who this economy serves and who it sacrifices. Every camera flash in that ballroom was powered by someone's second job. Every toast to American greatness echoed across towns where food banks are serving record lines. And that's the essence of Trumpism, performative prosperity, built on invisible suffering. He preaches America first, but what he means is America's elite first. The rest get leftovers, if any. Here's the data the networks ignored. The top 5% of U.S. agribusiness profits soared 42% since the tariff wars began. The median food worker's wage fell 7% after inflation. 40 million Americans now rely on food assistance, a record for a so-called booming economy. And yet, the administration frames this as stability. They call hunger transition. They call exploitation resilience. It's economic gaslighting at a national scale. What makes this so dangerous isn't just the policy, it's the psychology. When the powerful convince the powerless that suffering equals strength, democracy becomes obedience with better branding. When the media normalizes banquets during breadlines, inequality becomes entertainment. And when citizens stop questioning, the system doesn't need to silence them. It just feeds them slogans until they starve quietly. But here's where the illusion cracks. You can't eat patriotism. You can't pay rent with propaganda. And sooner or later, every empire built on denial faces the bill. That's why this story matters. Because it's not just about steak or tariffs or one man's dinner. It's about a nation where policy became spectacle and leadership became appetite. And as Trump raises his glass to American greatness, millions of Americans are raising something else, their awareness, because the revolution doesn't always start with riots. Sometimes it starts with a receipt and the realization that the real war wasn't about trade or tariffs or China. It was about who gets to eat and who gets eaten. This is Richard D. Wolff. And if you're still hungry after this story, look around because the table's been set and your silence is what's on the menu next.